One day in September 1926, a young Jewish journalist boarded a Berlin train. His name was Leopold Weiss. All around him he saw faces that were unhappy and vacant. Europe's high culture, the advancement of sciences and material progress weren't enough to make its people happy. By the time Weiss stepped onto the platform again, he was convinced salvation lay somewhere else. Born in 1900 to Jewish parents whose forefathers were rabbinical clerics, he formally converted to Islam a few days after that Berlin trip. When he died almost a century later in 1992, he was an acclaimed intellectual known all over the Muslim world as Muhammad Asad. The Road to Mecca, his famous memoir, has helped introduce Islam to countless people. Sayyid Qutb, a leading figure in the pan-Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, drew from Assad's work to shape his own views on political Islam. Margaret Marcus, a young Jewish woman, left behind a life in New York to live in Lahore after reading The Road to Mecca. She adopted the name of Maryam Jamila and became a well-known Islamic scholar. Assad's English translation of the Quran is ranked alongside that of Marmuduk Pickthall and Abdullah Yusuf Ali. While his train experience has often been written about, his conversion was anything but the result of a sudden revelation. It was in part related to the turmoil that young Assad witnessed in Europe after the devastating World War I. Assad fell in love with the Arabs before he fell in love with Islam, says Shalom Goldman, a professor of religion at the Duke University, who is writing a book on prominent Jews who converted to Islam. Islam was a way of being an Arab. That's why instead of going to a religious school, he went to live with the Bedouins for 6 years in Saudi Arabia. For him that was the real authentic culture, not Egypt's Al-Azhar University or studying in Pakistan, at the time the British colony of India. Assad first encountered the Muslim world in 1922 when he traveled to Palestine on the invitation of his uncle, Dorian, a psychiatrist and one of Freud's disciples. That was a time of political upheaval and strife in Palestine. Zionists were lobbying for a Jewish nation, sometimes violently. Tens of thousands of Jews were migrating to Palestine from Russia and elsewhere, altering the demography. One of Assad's closest friends in Palestine, Jacob de Haan, a Jewish Dutch journalist, was killed by Zionist extremists because of his persistent opposition to how the Arabs were being treated. Years later, when Israelis tried to lay claim to all of Jerusalem, Assad would continue to defend the rights of Palestinians. He spoke and wrote about how Islam views Jerusalem as a holy city for all the religions and not real estate given in patrimony to the Jewish people alone. Years later, when he was asked to speak on his Quran translation, Assad instead dedicated a great part of his speech on why he thought God chose to send his last messenger to the Arab lands. A tough life in the desert made a Bedouin realize his own insignificance. Generally, Muslim students spend years studying Islamic texts under the tutelage of experienced scholars at some religious school. In Assad's case, it remains unclear who he consulted for guidance. His detractors have often used this against him. We really don't know anything about his connections in the religious circles during his stay there, says Dr. Muzaffar Iqbal, founder of the Center for Islamic Sciences in Canada. In 2011, Riyadh arranged an international conference in Assad's honor. Assad's stay in Mecca and Medina had a deep impact on his understanding of Islam. It was then that he began ascribing to the Al-Hadith school of thought, which calls for a fresh interpretation of the Quranic verses and prophet sayings. Assad is not the only Quran translator who took a lenient approach on the question of women covering their heads or if Muslims can enjoy music. But he has been singled out by his critics. He's often attacked because of his European background, even though he learned Arabic from the Bedouins by living among them in their tents. He has probably lived in the desert for more years than any other scholar, says Mahmoud. Like in South Asia, where Assad is still seen by many as an outsider, he's not fully accepted in the Arab world, which is skeptical about a non-native who translated the Quran.